You can be seated. So we started this new sermon series on the Stations of the Cross. And last week, the station was all about standing up for the oppressed, standing up for the less than, standing up for truth. Now this station that we're going to talk about this week could easily be attached to it. It could easily be something that goes just right with that. It could have been one station because what's going on here takes place in our lives in different ways. This week's station is called Jesus Accepts the Cross. Now, in our text this morning, that actually happens at the end in John 19:17. But to get a real feel for what's going down, we need to begin at the start of chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him up in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over is guilty of a greater sin." From then on Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed them over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. So in this particular scripture, there are really only two primary players to talk about. We're going to talk about Jesus and Pilate this morning. I know that they're told the Jewish officials were there, but they're just kind of bit players. They're not the primary. They're not what's important to look at this morning. Now, I believe most Christians have a pretty good handle on Jesus and who Jesus was. But what about Pilate? What's our handle on him? What do we know about Pilate? What do we understand about who Pilate is? Not much is known of Pilate before his years as governor of Judea. Honestly, all we have are probablys. He was probably from a wealthy family. He was probably well connected politically. And he also had probably been a commander in the army in some fashion, in some way. We don't really know. We come off of those probablys because he is appointed as the 5th governor of Israel under Emperor Tiberius. Being the governor of Israel was a position of least status. So don't think it's exciting that Pilate has been appointed the governor. There were other places that were better places to be the governor. This was the least position, the worst one, the one nobody really wanted. And maybe that's why Pilate's reign of governor was a contentious one. Maybe he was grumpy. He got the worst job, the least job. There are many stories from early historians like Philo and Josephus about Pilate being at odds with the Jewish leaders or the Jews themselves, about how Pilate seemingly does things just to annoy them. Anybody ever done that before? Just done things to annoy somebody else? Anybody been on the receiving end? My kids have. That happens. There are stories of him putting the images related to his governorship of Israel or the emperor's rule on Jewish coins that caused an uprising. There are stories of him placing golden shields in the palace of Herod that caused an uprising. There are stories of him using the temple treasury to build aqueducts that, if you've already guessed, caused an uprising. You're on the right path. Regardless if all of these happened or just one of them, the overall issue is that Emperor Tiberius has already received complaints in some fashion about Pilate. Pilate is not doing a good job keeping the peace in Israel. He's already been reprimanded by the royal court. He's already been talked to by Tiberius at the time that this trial happens. After the trial, Pilate finds himself removed from being the governor of Israel with various charges of criminal activity and unrest. And most stories point to Pilate being beheaded or Pilate taking his own life under the order of the emperor for his failure as governor. So when you read this scripture and you see in verse 12 that the people suggest that whoever doesn't have an issue with Jesus, that whoever doesn't have a problem with this man is not a friend of Caesar's, it's scary for Pilate. He doesn't want any more trouble with Rome than he's already had. He doesn't want messages to go now that he let go somebody who was treasonous or seditious, because he's already had too many issues go down. So that's some information about Pilate to go with what we know about Jesus. And as you look at this scripture, this piece from chapter 19, it's really about how two different people handle one thing. It's about how they handle responsibility and consequence. For the most part, we have seen in this scripture how Pilate handles it. And Pilate handles it in such a way that he tries to give it to someone else, or tries to do anything other than accept it. If you were to pull together from all four Gospels the story of this trial before Pilate, you will see some of the things that he did as Jesus is sent to him. Pilate doesn't want a piece of it, so what does he do? He sends Jesus to Herod. Let Herod handle it. As Jesus comes back, Pilate has Jesus beat and mocked to try and make the crowd feel better. He offers a choice between Jesus and Barabbas. I can free one of them. Which one would you rather have go? If you read the scripture, he thinks this one's like a masterstroke, because would you rather have this prophet let go or this assassin murderous person? And the crowd's like, we want Barabbas. You see in this scripture that he appealed to law and to reason, that he could find no fault. There was no reason to kill Jesus. You also read in scripture that point where Pilate says, okay, I wash my hands of it. Pilate literally exhausts every option to absolve himself of the responsibility of this trial, but ultimately cannot. The only thing history really remembers about Pilate is an inability and unwillingness to do what was right and free Jesus. And so Pilate never escapes the responsibility that he's trying to get away from. And then if you contrast Pilate's actions with Jesus in verse 17, where it just says we are told that Jesus carried his cross. There is no story anywhere in Scripture of Jesus at this point trying to get out of it. There is no stories in Scripture of Jesus saying, no, I'm not going to do this. There's no stories of complaining. There's no stories of it was somebody else. There's no stories of this is wrong, don't do this to me. Jesus accepts the cross. What Jesus is doing is he is accepting the consequences of his actions. I shared with you last week, don't ever get it twisted. Don't ever miss out that nobody put Jesus on the cross except for Jesus. He made conscious choices, conscious decisions. This was the outcome of what he was doing. And he accepts it. You know, Pilate asks in the scripture about who he is. And his answers can be construed as treason, which was one of the few reasons that people were crucified at this time. I think sometimes we think that that's just what the Romans did when they executed people, is there's just rows and rows of crosses of people being crucified. Crucifixion only happened for one or two reasons for the most part. Either treason or petty theft. That's it. And the reason is Rome is setting an example in both directions. If you're going to do petty theft and take from others, here's the example of what you're going to get. If you're going to turn against Rome and try and overthrow Rome, here's what you're going to get. But there weren't other reasons. And so Jesus has to say things, has to do things that would fall on that treason side for him to end up on the cross. And everything that Jesus does through this night of trials accomplishes that goal. As you read the scripture, don't lose sight that Jesus is in charge all the time. And Jesus is accepting the results of all that he has said and done through the evening. Man, it even goes beyond Jesus accepting the responsibilities of his actions. Jesus is literally putting himself on the cross due to humanity's inability and unwillingness to take responsibility and accept consequences of actions. Jesus is stepping in and takes the consequence for us because we do not, we cannot, we will not. And so what does this all mean for us today? That's what's going on in the scripture. That's what's happening in this particular station. If you were participating in the Stations of the Cross and Jesus accepts it, what does that mean? What do we do with it? It's simple. We just answer the question, are we willing to accept responsibility for our action? Are we willing to accept consequences for what we do and what we say and how we approach life? This is one of the issues that I think is hard for people today. I think it's hard for them to accept actions and consequences. I think it's hard for them to accept that there are things that come from what we do. It reminds me of one of my youth, way back when. And they came to me and they had a quandary, they had a problem. So the basketball team was going to the playoffs, but also I had a youth trip scheduled at the same time. Now what you need to know is I didn't schedule on top of things. I looked at the calendar when most of the youth were off. And there's no guarantee the basketball team gets to the playoffs, so I can't schedule youth activities around what may or may not happen. So I picked a time when most youth would not be doing something to do this trip. And they came to me and said, what do I do? Do I go on the trip or do I go to the basketball playoffs? And I told them, I was like, that's not my responsibility to answer for you. It's not my responsibility to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. What I will tell you is whatever you choose, own it. Whatever comes from it, own it. It was your choice. Will there be benefits to going on the youth trip? Absolutely. Are there benefits to playing in the playoff game that you may never get to do again? Absolutely. It's a hard choice. It's not easy. I get it. But whatever you choose, it's yours. Accept the consequences. Accept what comes from that choice. And so they ultimately chose to go on the youth trip. And the coach did not allow them to play in the basketball playoffs the whole rest of the time. And the parents and this youth and the coach held me responsible for the decision that this youth made. They told me I shouldn't have scheduled a youth trip when there were going to be playoffs. They told me that I should have told this youth, go do the playoffs. They told me that I should have done anything but having them make a choice. And I tried to explain to everybody, it wasn't mine, it was theirs, but we need to help this youth understand they made a choice, accept it. But I got to tell you, 3 years later, I was still having conversations with the same parent, the same youth, the same coach. They would bring it up. Remember that time when you scheduled this youth trip on top of this? You shouldn't have done it. I'd like to tell you that is a one-time story, but that happened to me a lot as a youth pastor and talking with youth and talking with parents. That happened to me a lot in church ministry. That happens to me a lot in life around me. I'm going to be honest with you, that happens to me sometimes. This inability, this desire to not accept the consequences of actions. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm quick to say when things go well, I did that, that's awesome. But I'm also quick at times to when they go well, don't go well. Well, you know what, if such and such had just done this. Anybody ever been there? I'm going to accept it when things are awesome, but when they can fall apart, it was somebody else's fault. I mean, how quick are we to take responsibility and say the consequences that are good as humanity when they're awesome and say we did this, and how quick are we to blame God when they don't go well because it was God's fault? It can't go both ways. It can't be all the good stuff is us and all the bad stuff is someone else up to God. We have an inability, an unwillingness to accept the consequences of our actions. We don't like it. This morning I would share with you as a people of God, are we going to be like Pilate? Looking for ways out of responsibility, looking for ways to shift the results and consequences we don't like to someone else? Or are we going to be like our namesake? And Jesus says that word Christian, accepting consequence, embracing the results of our actions, saying, yes, I did that. Again, ultimately, Pilate is held responsible. He was not able to get away from this trial. Again, it's the only thing he's remembered for in all of history. That's a reminder to us, there is no escaping the consequences of actions. There's only how we accept them. This may not seem like a big deal, but it is. This idea of accepting the consequences of our actions is the backbone of integrity, of us being who we say we are. And at the end of the day, integrity is the most important thing we have in telling the story of Christ. It's the most important thing we have in introducing people to Christ. if we can't be trusted, then how do we share this story that is fantastic about the God who made us, the God who came to live amongst us, and the God who sacrificed himself for us? Integrity is key. And amongst integrity that makes it key is this idea, this understanding that as we do things, we accept, good or bad, what happens. I did that. We accept what comes from it, good or bad. This morning, as Lauren comes to lead us in our last song, I don't know where you find yourself in this idea of accepting the consequences of your actions. But I hope you'll spend some time thinking about it. I spent a lot of time in my office this week thinking about the things I have done, stuff has happened in the past. Did I accept, or did I push it off on someone else? Did I say, yes, I had done this thing, let's learn from it and do better? Or did I blame it on someone else and say, if they had done it better, it would have been better? Again, this is the example presented to us in this Station of the Cross and in this scripture. Are we like Pilate, or are we like Jesus? I invite all who are able to stand and to sing.